So it is Sunday, August 21st. It's day 169, and I want to focus on leadership. I do these daily updates on what's going on in Ukraine, and generally a pattern emerges where I can focus on this or that. Sometimes I just, hit one idea after another and they're not related. But today I want to talk about leadership. If you look at what's going on in the eastern side of the country, this is the Donbass area, Donetsk, where like this was Lysychansk, and this is Donetsk, where the Russians have been trying to take ground over the last month, and nothing really has changed since the Russians took Severodonetsk and Lysychansk across the river. Nothing's really changed. They want Sloviansk and Kremensk and Servetsk. I would have thought would have fallen by now. I would have thought that Bakhmut would have fallen at this point because the Russians were just like, they seemed intent. But the Ukrainians also were pretty intent and they've stopped things here. And as I thought about this, I thought, this area is a great metaphor for what we're about to talk about why leadership is important in what's going on here now. I'm going to start here with the Institute for the Study of War and their assessment. The ISW does a masterful job of covering these things daily. And so let's just talk about a couple of highlights here. Russian forces momentum from territorial gains around Bakhmut and Advika in late July is likely exhausted. They've been at this for a month and they haven't been able to make any ground. And Russian attacks in eastern Ukraine are likely culminating, even though very small Russian advances will likely continue. Like they attacked, it was like yesterday or the day before yesterday, Bakhmut 13 times and with no success. So they're just going through a meat grinder here and not getting anywhere. But why do they keep doing the same thing? Well, they're ordered to from above. There's a leadership issue here. Okay, the Russian forces' failure to capture or capitalize on prior gains around Bakhmut and Advika is an example of more fundamental Russian military problem: the demonstrated inability to translate tactical gains into operational successes. I'll try to explain why in a little bit, but they just keep pounding the same thing, and they just they're not changing. And why aren't they changing? And what's going on? Okay. And then here again, Russian forces attempted several unsuccessful here. They attempted unsuccessful here, limited gains there, unsuccessful ground assaults there, several assaults in this. Right. They keep doing the same thing, but it's not getting them anywhere. Okay. So as I was thinking about this was reminding me of Hitler, believe it or not. Now, it's a very strange thing. I did my master's thesis. On the Third Reich, on how people became non-people, and so I became very familiar with what Hitler was doing. I read Goebbels' diaries. He was their propaganda guy, and that's why I focus a lot on propaganda as I do these particular daily updates. But Hitler, so he was very right tactically in early on about certain things, but he was very, very wrong tactically about other things. Now, I don't mean right in his ideology. I mean like he made some really strident, audacious objectives with the military, and they won. And then so after that, he was just kind of convinced of his own brilliance, right? And he could be very right, but he could also lead him off a cliff, which is what he did. And so that's why it reminded me of Hitler. I also I study these guys. Okay, so I'm a professor who has created a master's degree in leadership, a minor in leadership. I'm building a major in leadership, a bachelor degree in leadership, and so I study these kinds of things, right? And I read books on cult leaders and dictators. I've watched videos like The Dictator's Playbook, which you see here, which, by the way, it's on Prime. It's well worth watching just to kind of understand how crazy dictator types think. So I'm watching this, and I'm watching Saddam Hussein. Now, if you remember, Saddam Hussein, after he's captured, he's in this courtroom. There's really amazing scene. He's in the courtroom, and he's like talking to the judge, like, you can't talk to me like that. Who do you think you are? You can't, right? There's a reason that he thinks like this. And he thinks like this because, like, in his world, he has so humiliated and demoralized people around him that they just suck up to him. And so, yes, boss, you're right. Yes, this is the right thing. Yes, you're so smart. And so that's how they stay alive and in power. And so he, after a while, has a very distorted view of the world, and he can't really think like rationally because he's not getting the information that he needs. Now, that leads me to the main point, and that's this. The article I want to focus on is this: autocracies tend to make catastrophic decisions. That's the case with Putin. And I think this is really, really fascinating. Um, so, if you look at how a democracy functions as opposed to how an autocracy or dictatorship functions, they're very different things. The democracy has to factor in a lot more information, and the dictator, the autocrat, does not. He gets to make the rules and he gets to say things and do things and choose what to do, but he's either right or he's very, very wrong, and there's catastrophic potential results. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few paragraphs in this, and I think you'll understand what I'm saying. And then we want to compare against Zelensky for a little bit. Russia's war against Ukraine has been hampered by failings experienced by autocratic states during conflict, according to a far-reaching new study of command of war by one of the UK's most prominent academics in the field. The big theme, said Freeman, emeritus professor of war at King's College London, is that autocracies are very bad at this. It doesn't mean democracies are good, they're just less bad. A lot of most catastrophic decisions come from the autocratic decision making. That's certainly the case with Vladimir Putin, but also Saddam Hussein, even the Argentine military dictator during the Falklands War. Like they get these ideas in their head and they're just like, we're just going to make this happen, like as if they could will it through. Autocracies don't have the feedback mechanism, and they dig themselves in, believing that the advantage of autocracy is bold, decisive decision making. And there is kind of a bit of an advantage because they can move quickly. They can move more quickly early on. It will take democracies a little time to catch up with that because they have more to consult. But it's not that much of an advantage where it overcomes the disadvantage of if you decide we're going to run off a cliff, we're going to run off a cliff really quick. While in certain circumstances, you can tolerate quite a lot of bad decision making and come out all right because you have superior numbers. Where it's very tight, one poor decision or a bit of bad luck can put you out completely. That's right. So if you have overwhelming force, you can make a number of bad decisions. But when it starts to get down to the wire, the autocracy is in a worse position than the democracy as far as decision making. By the way, you can even see this in the way that governments are set up. There's a reason why the legislature is usually a body of hundreds of people so that they can make very well-informed decisions, and the executive is usually a single person, not a hundreds of people kind of thing, so they can make quick decisions. So you put those two together and then you have something powerful. But if it's a real autocracy, the legislature is only a rubber stamp and it doesn't really matter. Okay, in Ukraine, Russia appears to have been constrained by domestic political considerations from introducing general mobilization, which has limited the scale of the forces it can employ. And now Putin has consistently said this is just a limited special military operation and it's not a war. And at this point, he's really, even though he's an autocrat, a dictator, he still, it would be very, very difficult for him without a false flag operation, maybe blowing up the Kremlin or something, that, you know, and then blaming the Ukrainians, to get the support of Russia completely behind him to have a full mobilization. So he's kind of in a bind because of the way that he lied about things in the very beginning. Okay, why Putin, whose force has been limited in scope before Ukraine, embarked on such a dangerous and badly prepared gamble for Ukraine? Why would he do that? Well, he was getting fed bad information because in an autocratic system, just sucking up and telling the boss what he wants to hear is the way that you get ahead. Now, this doesn't mean that this doesn't happen to democracies. We found out that it was happening in the U.S. with bad information of what was going on in the ground in Afghanistan, or it happened in Vietnam. But the scale in which it happens is usually much higher in an autocracy than it is in a democracy. Okay, military force he used very effectively in Chechnya, Crimea, Georgia, Syria, and this is the way that he made his bones. Like the Chechnya thing, we think was made up, and then he went and just devastated the country, brought it back into into Russia's into part of Russia proper, and that's kind of how he made his chops early on. And Georgia, nobody did anything, and Syria, he was brutal in Syria. Okay, anyway, let's keep going. You have to assume that he didn't realize the gamble that he was taking. He genuinely thought Ukraine would crumble quite quickly. That's because he was getting bad information from the FSB. And it's now hard to know. It's hard to know why. Even those foreign analysts who thought Ukraine's military might not do well didn't believe that Ukrainian people would succumb, but he did. Now, he did. He believed it, even if other military analysts didn't. And part of this was because of Zelensky, because Zelensky was quite a wild card. Where, I mean, think about 2014 when the president folded under, what, 90 days, 100 days of his people's pressure and then ran off to Moscow. He never thought that Zelensky would hold as long as he had, but he had, because Zelensky was a different character altogether, and he understood certain things. He didn't see it as a special military operation that would, or he did see it as a special military operation that would last just a few days, and that's what he thought. That's what he was counting on. Experts on Ukraine and Russia don't seem to have been consulted. It looks like Putin was talking to his mates in the FSB and the GRU, that's the military intelligence, who shared his prejudices. Now, that's why diversity is important, because interacting with diverse mindsets. I don't just mean diversity in color or gender. I mean diverse thinking. If you get diverse thought, you have some protection. Okay. He finds it very hard to take Ukraine and its president, Volodymyr Zelensky, seriously. I think he thought Zelensky would make a deal, and he didn't. And Zelensky was thinking about it. There was this great interview with The Economist magazine where Zelensky was saying, I know that if I had to send a clear message to my people that I'm staying here and that I'm not running, and neither should they. And that's right. He was thinking about it as a leader. The heart of the problem, Friedman believes, is the rigid hierarchical nature of the Kremlin's decision making. And you see that also reflected in the Soviet military. And this is why so many generals have been killed, because the Soviet military is very top heavy on the officer. The highest ranking officer makes a decision and everybody follows it, as opposed to distributed leadership throughout the ranks in the American military model and other Western militaries. And so if the top guy gets picked off, they don't know exactly what to do because he had all the information. Okay, there are no incentives to tell the truth on the ground in higher command. They've sacked lots of generals, and I'm just talking about that. They've sacked lots of generals now that they know that there's a problem, but it's not them that's the problem. It's always someone else. You can always point at somebody else. It's not how you, whether you win or lose, it's how you place the blame, remember, right? Okay, and since Russia's first plan to topple Ukraine, Moscow has struggled to find a credible plan B. Remember, it was going to take the whole country, and then that didn't work. So, well, we just meant Donbas, and maybe some other regions, and they're not exactly, and their messaging isn't right because they don't know exactly what they're after. Okay, Friedman struggles to understand the logic of the Kremlin, not least its tactic of creating a wintertime energy crisis in Europe to undermine support for Kyiv. Now, I think the only theory of victory that the Kremlin has at the present is that the West turns on Ukraine because of the energy crisis. But the surprise there is that Moscow has not asked for a ceasefire now. That would put Zelensky on the spot. Right. So let's talk about the winter energy thing first. So if Putin is thinking, well, it's going to really, the cost of energy is going to really drive the West nuts. And so we're going to just endure this winter, and then they're going to come to the table. That's his only card that he can play. Why not? If you're Putin, why not just say, no, we want peace. We have killed all the, let's say, the Azov fighters, or we've captured the Azov. Those were the Nazis, it turns out. And so we now have this real estate. We want peace. Please give us peace. Now, the Ukrainians can't do that. They won't do that. And so that would make the Ukrainians look like the aggressors, even though they're not. And so half of Europe would probably splinter off and go, the peacenik types in Europe, not those who are seeing this as aggression. Like the Baltic states would never get behind this, but some would peel off, and then it would put pressure on Zelensky to have to create some kind of terrible compromise. But Putin's not doing that. Putin is still acting as though he expects more from this war than he's already gotten. So he sees the same lack of institutional imagination defining the future trajectory of the war. This is Friedman, the author here, and he says, I think Russia will doggedly carry on, if for no other reason that they can't think of anything better to do. The Kremlin is paralyzed because they don't have enough thinking. Now, Again, this is a sweet spot for me. I spend a lot of time doing these daily updates, and since the summer, since I have from day 85 to today, day 179, I have all these, like I've done these, like I have daily episodes trying to explain what's going on the ground. And I wanted to highlight this. And I wanted to highlight it particularly because I started out by doing this. I'm a management professor who teaches leadership stuff. And actually, this is what I do. The other site is Professor Gertis Daily Updates on Ukraine. This one is just Professor Gertis, management professor, author, and I talk about leadership. And I started talking about and when the war began, I talked to a military expert how to defend a city. I was talking about President Zelensky, how did he unite the world? And then I realized, uh-oh, I'm really talking to two different audiences, and so I separated these two messages. But this is really the sweet spot. Now, when I started talking about Zelensky, here, I wrote this book about 3 weeks into the war. You know, you hear the thing about, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. I thought, who is this guy? And I started studying Zelensky, and then I've been updating ever since. And Zelensky really did something very, very different. And he understood exactly what he needed to understand. First, what is the goal? And the goal was, we will not just succumb. We will stay and fight. And then he did this with his person by staying himself, not taking the ride. He did it in his person by his messaging. I'm here, taking the selfie out, or the video out on the streets of Kyiv. I'm here, the prime minister's here, the head of the administration office is here. We have not fled. We are not traitors. My wife and children are here in Ukraine. We have not fled the country, right? So he sent a very clear, coherent message. But the difference between Zelensky and Putin is that where Putin was surrounded by his advisors, kind of browbeating him the day before or a couple days before the invasion, like, and what's your report? And well, and trying to like make sure that he's giving him the answer that he wants. Zelensky's there surrounded by his advisors, and it looks like a them, not a him trying to tell them what to do. It was a very, very different thing. These are two very different leaders, extremely different leaders. And Zelensky, even the head of the EU Council, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if it's council or commission, she, van der Leyen, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, was complimenting Zelensky for, like, you've continued to operate in a democratic fashion, even in spite of the war, like leaning on the Verkhovna Rada, their parliament, for advice and structure and whatever. Now, they're all fairly unified, so it's easier to do that. But even in the middle of the war, they've not let democracy go. And there's power in that. There's safety in numbers. There's safety in the multitude of advisors, the proverbs say, right? And so that's the difference between what's going on with Putin and what's going on with Zelensky, and I think that's a great lesson for today. Hey, thanks for listening to me rant and rave about this. I love the subject of leadership, and I'm very happy to see that I can apply it here when we're talking about Ukraine. Come back tomorrow. If you've listened this far, please subscribe. Actually, subscribe to both. Just look up Professor Gertis, Professor Gerdes, and I will be back to talk to you again tomorrow.